So I'm Marc Zeedar. I publish XDev magazine, and which is we basically do a PDF every other month. But I also do XDev Library, which is an a la carte service. You don't have to buy a subscription. You can just buy individual articles or ebooks and things like that. And I'm here to talk about PowerXS. So how many of you have used XojoScripts? You like XojoScripts? Okay. About half of you. So first thing I'll do is just give you a quick little overview of what XojoScript is. So XojoScript itself, so they're basically, it's a class that you put in your main app, and then you feed it some text, which is the actual script, and then it'll compile and run that within your main program. And the actual XojoScript language is just the bare bones of XojoScript, right? It's just for next loops, assigning variables, you can define functions, things like that, but it's just the bare language. And so what often gets confusing for people is they don't realize that you can't actually use a lot of what we think of as Xojo, like for example, the date object. Note I'm still using API 1.0, but folder item objects, okay? These are all actual classes that are part of the Xojo framework, but they're not technically part of the Xojo language, right? But we use them so much in our Xojo applications, we tend to think, oh, this is Xojo, but it's actually not. It's part of the framework. So the problem with XojoScripts is you go to write your XojoScript and you like refer to a date, and it hits that and it says, I don't know what a date is. This is a syntax error. And so even something as simple as like end of line, that's actually a function that's part of the framework, and so it returns whatever carriage return or end of line character is appropriate for that platform. That's not going to work in the XojoScript. Okay, so a lot of people who are just getting started with XojoScript, this can be really frustrating. There are some ways around that, and how many of you have used the context object? You know what the context object is? Okay, the context object is definitely something when you're getting started with XojoScript, it's a little confusing. But the best way I look at it is just imagine your XojoScript is running in a little sandbox over here in the corner. It has its own little world, its own little planet. It's just whatever it does, it knows about itself. It doesn't know anything about the actual main Xojo app that you're running that it is part of. And the reason they do that is so that the XojoScript itself cannot like mess up your app, right? It can't like change some variables or rewrite data or do anything like that. And so the problem with that is, how do you get data back and forth between your XojoScript, right? So if you have a XojoScript, say it's doing some calculations, you need a way to find out what those calculations are, right? What happened. And so the traditional way to do that is to use a context object. So a context object is you just pick any class, any object that's in your main Xojo program, and you say, you're my context for this XojoScript. And then anything that class has, any public methods, functions, properties that are in that context object are then available to that script. So a perfect example of that is, let's say your context object had a method, a function defined like this, okay? Today, a string creates a new date, returns the short date for that, right? So it's just returning today's date. Basically, today is defined as a string, right? So your XojoScript would actually see this function. All it knows is there's an object, there's a word called string, called today, that's a string, and you can just work with it as a string. So in your XojoScript, you would then be able to, assuming s is a string, s equals s plus today, and it would work, right? Because the XojoScript just says, oh, today is a string. I can work it anywhere I can work with strings, right? So the XojoScript still doesn't know anything about what a date is, but it can work with this. So this is the traditional way that you can actually pass information to and from your script. You can create a property or a method in your context object, and it becomes available to your script. The problem with this is there's some limitations, okay? First limitation is now we're doing non-standard Xojo code, right? There is no today command in regular Xojo code, right? So in a sense, you're kind of creating your own language. You're defining your own names and properties and values and whatever, and using it in your scripts. And as long as it's a project just for yourself, or depending on what you're trying to do with it, that could be all you need to do. But it does create some problems because, for example, let's say you want to go to some other code that you've already reused in another project. You want to copy that and put it into a script. It's not going to work, right? Or vice versa. You got a script and you go, I want to put this into my program, into the IDE, into a method or something. It's not going to work because it goes, there's all these non-standard things that are not part of that. So that is can be kind of a problem. The bigger problem, though, is there's no way to send these unknown objects back and forth between the two. So even though you've now got a system, the context object, that can send information back and forth, you can only send basic data types. You can send strings, integers, things like that, but you can't send, say, a folder item because, again, XojoScript doesn't know what a folder item is, right? So that's kind of a bigger problem. So what I came up with a few years ago was basically I came up with a way to manually replicate Xojo objects. So example I use is this is code that I had created for the date object. I called it date class, and I came up with basically this code that's on the screen is the code that would actually be in your XojoScript. Okay, so in the XojoScript, I'm defining what a date class object is that's going to work exactly like the date in Xojo, right? But again, it doesn't know anything about what an actual date is. And I could have recreated this code. You can see here, basically, I'm sending information. I'm making calls. Some of these commands like date _ get year. That's a call back to the main program, to the context object, okay, to get that result. I could have actually done my own date complication, actually like done math and figured out dates, right? Problem with that, of course, is I may not use the exact same algorithm that Xojo is using, and it wouldn't work. There would be bugs, and it would be weird, and it'd be a lot of work too. So the way I came up with it was I just said, well, how about if I just come up with an ID number for this object? I send the ID number, an integer, back to the context object, and in the context object, I just create a dictionary with a bunch of dates in it, actual Xojo date objects that's running in the main program in the context object. And I can just look up those dates in the dictionary by the ID and then just work with that date object in the main program, which knows about dates. And so then the script doesn't have to know anything about dates, but because of my code, the way I built my code, the actual script that I write, making calls to these things, it looks and works just like an actual date object, right? My code is identical to any code that I would write in the IDE. There's literally no difference. But the actual information that's being passed back and forth is just an integer. So I'll explain this in a little bit more detail as we get into it. So let's look at how we define the class. So for example, we're defining the class. This is in the XojoScript. We say we've got a private date ID object or property as an integer. We have our constructor, which is calling the date _ new date is a special command I've written. It's a special function that I've written in the context object in the main program. That all it does is create a new date. I'll show you the code for that in a second, and returns the actual date ID, right? So this happens automatically with the constructor. So your code in the XojoScript is literally just dimd as new date, and it automatically internally gets a hidden ID object that always follows that particular date around as long as it's alive, and then it can look that up in the table back in the main program. So here's the function that does that. So this is the date _ new date. It's actually creating a dictionary. If a dictionary doesn't already exist, it's just using it just increments an integer as the actual ID and assigns it a new date, and then it returns the ID. It doesn't return the date, it returns the ID, right? So again, the script is just having each object you create in the script is going to have a different ID that we can look back up in the main program. So this worked great, okay? again, only IDs are passed. We're not actually passing, we can't really magically make the XojoScript really understand what dates are, but we can fool it. And back in the main thing. So this example of the day function. So we can actually, you'll see there's one that returns the day, and then there's one that actually assigns the day. And so based on whether or not you're setting the date or setting the day or returning the day, these are the two functions that would get called based on that. And all this is doing is, this is code that's actually in the context object, right? So this would, your script would not actually, see this. It would just use the day function of the cloned date. So the problem with this is that basically it's a bit of work to do all this, right? So I came up with what I call PowerXS, which is a system that is going to automate some of this for us, okay? So the basic way we do it, it's a system that helps us port the Xojo framework over to XojoScript. So a few caveats, it's still at developmental stage. The context portion right now still must be created manually. I'm thinking it's probably going to be impossible, or a lot of work to, I don't know if it would be completely possible to create that automatically, but I'm thinking maybe down the road I could make the context portion actually create like a template, so it would just generate all of the methods, and then you have to actually go in and put in the code for how that would work. But right now, PowerXS will actually generate the script portion automatically. So all that definition, the class definition of what the date object is, or say the folder item, or a picture class, or whatever you want to clone, that all gets generated by my system. It's also API 1.0. I haven't updated it. That's a fairly minor thing to update at some point, but I just haven't. That's been a priority. So the way this works, so I should point out too that there's two different parts you want to understand about PowerXS. So if you just want to use it, super simple. You don't have to know anything about how it works. You can just throw it into your program and use it. And the reason for that is PowerXS is a subclass of the XojoScript object, right? So anywhere you have a XojoScript in your program, you can just replace it with a Power XojoScript, PowerXS object. It'll still work exactly the same, right? The only real difference to do it is I have the set source command that you see here. You have to set the source of the script there via my command, just because it does some extra work when it sets up that source. It's basically adding all that code that the object definitions that the script is going to need. So once you've done this, you run it just like you normally would, and then within your script you could use any of the framework's items. In this case right now, it's currently the date and the folder item objects. So I'm going to show you a little demo here. This is a little demo program that I wrote. And basically it's just going to load some of these, change the resolution of my screen a little bit, I just realized. Okay, so we're just loading this. This is a very simple demo. I've got 4 buttons on the left here. These just load different scripts into this text area at the top, which is just some basic code, basic Xojo code. And when we push the run script down here, it's going to show us the result down there. So if I hit that, it's actually executing all this and putting the thing down here. And this is live, so if we go in and we say change it to the year to 23, we hit it, you can see down here that the new date is now 23. What's important about this is if you look here, this code looks like regular Xojo code, right? I'm working with the date object just like I would in Xojo, right? I'm assigning things, I can do whatever you want. It works just like a date object, right? And yet, technically it is sort of, because there is a real date object behind the scenes, but the script itself really doesn't know anything about it. But I've created a date object in the script that works just like the real thing. So we can also do the same thing with folder items. So this is a very simple, I can make this window a little bit bigger. But I guess it doesn't really need to be bigger, but it'll be better for the next one. So basically this one's, we're defining, a new folder item. We're going to give it a name. We're going to tell us what the name is. We're going to see if it exists. So you can see we're using exists.name. We're using a lot of the aspects as we can set the name. So basically what this one does, I've actually got a little demo folder right here. And you'll see we actually have a file already there called test.txt. And so what happens with this script is it's either going to, let's see if I can actually, I've got a big enough screen here, I can move this over, you'll see it happen in real time. But basically all this script does is if the name is test, it replaces it, it changes it to test2, and if it's test2, it changes it to test, right? Real complicated script here, but if we hit that, okay, first it's asking me, this is just because of the Apple security stuff, just wanting to make sure I have permission, but you'll see here it says it changed the name. We look there on the desktop, you can, on the folder, and you guys see that down there? It's actually changed it to text2, right? We run it a second time, and it changes it back. So we zoom in down there, and now it's test again, right? So pretty simple demo. Let's load up folder item script number 2. This one's going to do something a little bit more complicated. It's going to do very similar kind of thing. Basically, I always, in all my folder items, I always add some extension methods for read text and write text that just reads the text file and writes the text file. So I added those to my clone. So basically, this is just going to load it up. It's going to do a replace all the E's with question marks, or if there already are question marks, it'll replace them all back to E's. So if we run this script, boom, we go over here to the test file, and I'll zoom in so you can actually see it. You'll see that all the E's are now question marks, right? So if we run it a second time, go back and look at the file, zoom in on it, and now the question marks are all back to E's, right? Really complicated. Let's look at a more complicated script. So this one here, first part's pretty similar. I'm actually looking at a new, I'm using .flength, right, to get the length of the file. I'm actually going to test out, is it actual folder or not? If it's not a folder, it'll print out it's not a folder. I'm actually going to create a folder, so it's going to do a new folder I'm called test folder. It's going to see if it's a folder, and if it is, how many items it contains. It's got a few different things here. Then we get down here, we're actually going to create a folder called new folder, and you can see it, and we're going to copy the test.txt file into it. Okay, and you can see here, this looks like regular Xojo code. This is actually a XojoScript that normally can't do any of this, right? We're working with folder items. So if I hit run script here, we're going to see, look at that, right over there. It created a new folder with a copy of that same text file inside it. And this one here is using, like, you can see it's actually using the child command and the parent command, all that kind of stuff. And it works just like a regular thing. So what I haven't done and I'll explain it in a little bit I'll go back to the presentation and show you. But basically there's some limitations. I haven't completely done copied, cloned everything of the folder item class. The main one I haven't done is anything that works with dates, like the modified date or change date, things like, or no, it's the same thing, modified date or just the date, created date, that's what I was saying. And that's mostly because, as you'll see when we get a little bit more into how PowerXS works, there's some complications about, I'm basically, right now it's supporting like standard data types like integer, strings, things like that. So I have to be able to make my system work with an object that it doesn't know about, like date. And so I'll have to work on that, but I'll explain it a bit more. So basically, if you want to actually work with PowerScript, you don't have to know anything else I'm going to talk about, right? You just throw it in there, just use it, right? If you want to expand this and add, say you want to add a picture class or some other part of the folder of the framework to your XojoScripts, then you kind of want to know how this works so that you can add it to yourself. But the whole idea is it's designed to make it really easy to port more of the framework to XojoScript. So basically, the context methods, you have to have a method for every single property or function of the original object, right? So date, we have things like the day property, for example, and it can be retrieved or set. So we need basically two. We need a pair, and this is just some sample code to show the day object. You can assign it or you can refer to it. So because of that, you have to have a getter setter pair of methods, right, for anything that's like that. But so this is the function, this is the code in your context object that actually, so it's just looking up the date in the dictionary and returning the day object, right? And then to set it, it looks up the date, sets the date, assigns it the day integer that you've passed from the script, and then it sets it. I have a function called setDate from ID, which just all it is looking up that date object in the dictionary and then assigning whatever you told it to do, the new date, right? So it saves the date, basically. So what's important here is that the context methods have to follow a specific naming scheme that I've come up with, which is basically the name of the class, an underscore, and then the original property or method name, whatever you're trying to clone, okay? So for example, date underscore abbreviated date, folder item underscore count, right? So basically, where you normally would have the dot in a command that you're going to be using, you replace it with a folder, with an underscore, really? And so what happens is my program, the PowerXS, is actually using introspection to go in and look at all these methods, and it's looking for date underscore, and then anything else it finds, it creates a method, a definition for that that's going to end up in your actual XojoScript. And that's basically the key to it for how it works. So this is an example of the actual code that's part of PowerXS. So right now I've created the date object, and I've cloned the folder item object. And you can see some things we didn't show, like for example, folder item visible. I didn't show that, but that's got a triangle there, so it's a getter and setter, and you can set the visibility or assign the visibility. I expanded the folder item name, so you can see one of them just gets the name, and the other one passes the name to it, and that sets the name, right? So pretty simple, basic code. So these are really not that hard to create. The hard part of what you have to create is generating all that class definition code that ends up in your script. And so that happens automatically. You don't have to do any work to do that. Once this is built, it just works. So the only other one that's really important, is like I said earlier, is when you're creating a brand new object, you have to follow the format of the name of the class, underscore, and then new, and then the name of the class again. So date would be a little redundant, but date underscore new date, and folder item underscore new folder item, right? And it looks for those specific words to actually create, and this is an example we kind of looked at earlier, but this is basically the constructor, so it's just generating a new date for that, or it's calling that. And the cool thing is, because this is all the private, the date ID is a private, basically it's an invisible, ID that's part of that object. In your XojoScript code, you never see any of this. You never work with the date IDs. You just create an object and work with the object as though it's a full-fledged object. And behind the scenes, it's passing all this date, the actual integer ID behind the scenes. But you don't really work with that. That's all invisible to you. You just work with it like it's a date or a folder item, and it just works. So in PowerXS, I have a special routine called PXS underscore create class code, and this is what actually generates the code for that object, right? This is the code that's going to be embedded into the XojoScript that gives it the definition of that class. And so it examines that routine there is the one that actually goes and does the introspection and looks at what's actually defined in your context object, and then it generates that. So to work with that, it's very simple. You have a routine. Basically, it looks like this. You have for each object, I have an init method for it that you call first, which can do some initialization stuff. Then you just have basically this MPSX framework is just a string. It's just a big string of all the code that we're going to be adding to the script, and we pass it the create class code, which we pass it the name of the class that we're going to be duplicating. So we pass it date. Basically, that tells it I'm looking for the word date with an underscore after it, and then it uses introspection to get all those, right? So if you passed it the same thing with folder item, it would look for everything that begins with folder item underscore in the context object. So this is basically that same slide we had before, but this is what's generated from that. Just an example, right? So it's just, but this is all kind of tedious stuff because it's the same every time, and it's like, let's have it auto-generated so we don't have to do all that. So if you want to make a change, like I mentioned, I hadn't, cloned every single part of like the folder item class. If I went in there and added a new method, I can just hit run and boom, it works, right? Because it'll automatically generate this code and work with it. I don't have to do anything on the script side. So that's pretty cool. So, oops, I went too far. So again, just to reiterate that we're only passing, integer IDs back to the main program. So this example of the return date from ID routine that's part of the main, the context object. So it's just looking up the date object in the dictionary and returning whatever date is located. In this case, it's a new date. So it's just sort of look up and it returns the date. So if they couldn't find it, it would return today's date. So this isn't for error. So it'll always return a date that way. So some limitations here, like I said, right now I've only got the, at least that I'm willing to show, I've only got the date and the folder item implemented. Those are not even 100% complete. They are API 1.0 also. There's minimal error checking right now. The current code may need to be retrofitted and refactored to support new methods and object types, which is the example I was saying earlier about the folder item. Basically, it needs for it to get back a date. We want it to return an actual date in the script, right? A date object. So imagine if you defined, again, the script doesn't really know about dates, right? So if it's returning a date object, but we haven't defined a date yet, right? The script would see that date and go, I don't know what a date is, right? Even within the XojoScript. So you end up with some kind of interdependencies, right? You have to define the date. The date object has to be there before we can add the date object, refer to the date object, or pass it as a parameter in the folder item clone, right? So that gets a little tricky, and I may have to change some of my internal structure of how that works internally. So that's kind of reason I haven't really, put this, like, say, on GitHub or something and making it open source. But that's sort of my plan down the road, is to let it make it more available for people to do. But you can download everything you saw here. Download the project. It gives you, again, it's so simple. It's literally just one object, just a subclass of XojoScript, and you can just copy it out of that and drop it into your programs and play with it. But you'll get that full demo that you just saw with the different scripts, and you can play around with it and change the scripts and see what happens and play around with it. So if you're interested in making PowerXS better, contact me. I'm definitely open for any ideas, suggestions. I don't really consider myself a top coder or anything. So if there's ways that I'm not doing stuff in the right way, let me know. I'm definitely open for feedback and stuff. There's my email. And so I've got quite a bit of time for questions, actually. I figured that might provoke some questions, but I don't know. Have I explained it well enough? Do you have questions about it, or what do you guys think? Do you understand?
It's pretty straightforward, but I've never used XojoScript. I haven't had a need for
it.
What I'm doing.
Yeah.
But I know it, but
right.
that's what I'm not familiar with.
Well, what are you doing mostly?
Primarily web apps that move files around, do database entries, that type of stuff.
Okay.
Database queries.
Right. So right off the top of my head, I would say it depends on who your end users are, but one possibility might be the users could have scripts.
No.
That they would do something. You don't want them to do that.
The users can't have scripts.
Can't have scripts. Okay.
The users are manufacturing for operators.
Okay.
They don't have. The most they can do is scan a barcode into a field.
Okay. Well, how about this? Are there do you need to customize the web app for one user versus another user? No, they're all the same.
They're all the same.
Okay. Because another cool thing you can do with XojoScripts is almost like a plugin, right? So you could have, just like I did there by loading different scripts with the buttons, you could have, script A running for this client and script A running for this client, and they could do different things,
So the only thing
based on that,
if you
Yeah.
That type of thing. And I'm not encouraged that will actually be something that anybody
Would want. Yeah. It's not necessarily appropriate for.
They're used to doing their job, and I try to make their
Right.
job easy.
Right. The only other thing I could think of off the top of my head for what you're doing would be, like, one of the things that I love about XojoScripts is you can edit the script while the program's still running, right? So if you had a web app running, you could offload some of your logic of how it functions into a script and literally make changes to that running program without ever having to quit the web app, right? So zero downtime on the web app, right? You just load in a new script and it gets new functionality. You know what I mean? And that's something I've done with a number of things because I love that ability. I've got a lot of, like, from the magazine, I do a ton of little, well, for example, I've got one that just manipulates text files and just, it's kind of like super powerful find and replace that I got, but it's all based on XojoScripts. So anytime I'm working with some text files and I go, hey, I've got 50 text files that I need to do X on, I'll just write a little script and I add it to my program and I just drop the files in and boom, it does that script on all those files. And I probably have 50 scripts in that program now that I've added over the years. And sometimes it's for a one-off project that's real simple as renaming the file names or doing some find and replace and stuff like that on the files. Sometimes it's doing a lot more complicated stuff. It depends on what, sometimes it's stuff it definitely, it's the type of thing that you have to find some uses for. I mean, some use cases for it. But my favorite thing is just that I can keep a program running and not have to quit it, and you can make changes to the program, and it completely, do new things with it. And the other thing, like I said, like plug-in type stuff where you can customize things for different uses. Just pick a different script and it does something different. And so that could be another use for that kind of thing. But I just really like them. They're very fun, and I just like scripting. And that's kind of how I got into programming. Was my background was graphic design, and I used to use a product called OneClick back in the 90s. Remember, it's a macro program, but it had its own language, and it was so cool. You create these little palettes, and you just add a button, and into the button you put your code. And so it would support drag and drop, so you could grab some text, drop it onto the button, and it could do some code to like change the text and then send it back, things like that. And so I had palettes all over the place, and would people I would do graphic design, so people would bring me files in weird formats and stuff, and I would just drop them onto my palettes, and they would. Yeah, and they would do fix things, smart quotes or unsmart quotes or whatever you're wanting to do, things like that, and title case or just a variety of things, and it was just really, really handy. So when I got into real basic way back when, I had to create a whole program each time. So it was like, now I got to create a whole program from scratch just to do this one little function. And so when XojoScripts came along, I was like, wait a second, I just create one program and then have unlimited scripts that can do whatever I need to do. And so I have, I like that. And so I have a lot of programs that do that. And one of the examples I used at another conference was I have a program that does some, one program I have, it does, I've done several of these, but they basically go on the internet and scrape stuff off a website and pull the information back. So one of them, I like to read certain comic strips, but I hate all the websites that there's ads and all this crap. So my script actually parses the website's page, extracts just the image, and then puts it into a Dropbox folder. And it does this all automatically every morning. So basically, I just open up a Dropbox folder, and there's all my comics, and I can just go through the list and just see my comics for the day without any hassle and whatever. And so the reason I did it with XojoScripts is because a lot of these comic sites decide, we're going to change our HTML, and now your code for the thing breaks, and now I got to launch the IDE, go back in and recompile and create a whole new standalone app. And it's like, now I just got a script. So if something fails and it says no comics today, I go in and make a few changes, figure out what they changed, and most of the time it's something really minor that's stupid, and they're just changing the name of IDs of where they're hiding the image, and the URL of the image. And once I get that, then back to business, you know. And so, and I get comics from several, like 3 to 4 different sites, so I have a different script for each site. So only the certain ones would break, and then I just change it to that. So, and I did another one. I used to download the soccer schedule, soccer, and so I would download the MLS soccer schedule and put it onto like a visual thing that would show me when all the games were on, and kind of like a little time graph, and it would, boxes were, and the boxes were color coded by channel, so I knew which channel the game was going to be on. And since they their thing was just like a long list, and it was like you couldn't really tell like which games are overlapping and happening at the same time, and I couldn't figure out which. So I had the script that would do that, and they would change their code all the time, and so my program kept breaking. I said, I'm going to do this with XojoScripts. Then I can change it. So that was another example of doing web scraping is kind of a cool thing to do with XojoScripts, because they're always changing the HTML behind the scenes and breaking your script, and breaking your code, But any other questions about that kind of thing? Yeah.
So let's say you have a Xojo app that gives you a list of all the files in the folder.
Okay. Okay.
And you hit a button, let's say it fixed, let's say your desktop.
Okay.
And let's assume there's like 5 files.
Okay.
And it puts that in an array in Xojo.
Okay.
A script can't access that actual array, right?
It could if you were using PowerXS. It could, yes, because it knows an array is a standard data type.
Right.
I mean, it's not really a data. I guess it's a data type, but yeah, arrays work. So yeah, so you would have a property in your context object that would be an array of folder item, right? And then you would just define. I would say in your XojoScript, you would. How would that work? Let's see. I'd have to think about that because. Yeah, it should. No, it should.
Let's say
It should work because
the names of files stored as
the names would certainly work because that's just going to be a string. That's just going to be a string.
So if that app starts up and let's say it's the list,
Right. Then you would just refer to that array name in your script, and it would be an array that you can step through like you normally would, and it would have an array of string, and for I equals 1 is and u bound or whatever, and it would work with it would return those strings and those names.
when Xojo came out with the XojoScripts,
Mm-hmm.
they were always kind of saying, at least initially,
Yeah.
this is probably without your stuff.
Right.
You can't really access that information normally.
Well, that's, yeah, because by default, again, it's running in its own sandbox, and it can't access anything. But if you put that into the context object, it can access it. It just shows up like it's part of the the language there. The only thing I'm not sure on your example is if you defined it as folder items in the context object, since the script doesn't know actually what a folder item is, it knows what its type of folder item is, but it doesn't know that that's the same thing as the folder item in the thing. It knows it when you create it within the XojoScript. So you'd almost have to have like, create your own array of folder items in the script, and then get that from the from the ones in the from the main app. Yeah, that would be a little tricky. I have to think about that. But yeah, because basically, anytime you defined basically a property of that type, because normally if you defined f as folder item in your context object, right, you could use f in your script, but it's going to error because it's going to say, I got f here, but I don't know what a folder item is, and it's going to die. And there's no way to tell the script that f is the, I don't know. I'd actually have to test that, because I'm not sure. That's an interesting question, because I'm not sure if it's named folder item in the script, if it's passing the name, or if it's actually passing like some kind of object structure. I'd have to test that and see. That's an interesting question, because I haven't actually tried that. So that's really interesting. I gotta think about that. Because in theory, if it's passing the actual name, you know, this is a folder item, and the script says, oh, I've got a folder item object, I can work with folder items, and then it would work because it would be using its clone folder item. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll have to try that. I've never ran into that before. But most of the time when I'm working with objects like that, I'm creating them custom in the script, you know. But I have kind of thought about that because that was one of the reasons I haven't finished my picture class thing, because my thought was I would pass back like a JPEG. You can't actually pass back a like say your script is supposed to take, say you do a clone of the picture item, right, and you're gonna like do some manipulation on the image. Well, you can't just pass a picture back because again, you can't actually, you can only pass, you're only passing an ID, right? You can't pass the actual picture. So if you wanted, so yeah. But I thought, you know, well, you don't actually have to pass it back because the picture's in the main thing, so it can extract whatever the actual picture is. But I'm just thinking, like, you know, in the script, you could export it as a JPEG or something like that to work with it. If you wanted to say save the file or something like that, you would export it as a JPEG. But yeah, it gets a little tricky because you're
tricky with the context object and certain things.
right, because you're passing objects that need it, that this guy can understand, this guy can't. So it's but then you're cloning it and it sort of can, but yeah, it gets really confusing. But basically, there's a way. I mean, especially if it was just string, if it's just names, that would easily work for sure. But arrays do work. You can just have an array of whatever, you know, data type as long as it's in your context project and it's public and not private, then that array would show up in your script and you could work with it. And you can do everything you normally want to do on an array, because I use arrays tons of times in scripts. You know, add to it or delete from it or whatever you want to do. You know, it works. So, does that help?